All right, we're good to go.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month EPSP Connects. The purpose of this series is to bring the community together and to help establish connections between people who might not be able to interact with others in different settings. We are very happy to have you here. I would like to thank all of the EPSP Connect team members who helped plan and organize this series and reach out to potential speakers or panelists and coordinate with them and advertise on social media and make sure that the series information is up to date on the website. Joining me today as a co-host is Roberto Fernandez, who will help us with the Q&A session.
Elad, thanks. Thanks everyone for joining. If you happen to be watching the live stream on YouTube, we will be looking at the live stream there for questions. And then feel free to post your questions using the chat feature. And at the end, you might also be able to unmute depending on how things are going.
Thanks. Our speaker today is Dr. Muriel Bruckner. Dr. Bruckner is an assistant professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Louisiana State University. She holds Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in Environmental Engineering from the Technical University of Braunschweig in Germany and a PhD in Biogeomorphology from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. As a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Exeter in the UK and at the University of Texas at Austin, she studied fluvial dynamics in the Amazon River Basin and accretion in Mississippi River Delta. Today, Dr. Bruckner will be talking about modeling morphodynamics in estuaries and deltas and their feedbacks with ecosystem engineering. And now I would like to hand it over to our speaker, Dr. Bruckner.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers and to Elad for inviting me and organizing this awesome speaker series. This was a great summary already of my background. I'm going to talk about modeling morphodynamics and interactions with organisms in different landforms. And I work both with fluvial and coastal systems because in the interest of time today, unfortunately, I will not be talking about rivers. I hope folks are not disappointed. But I work with many estuaries and deltas, especially now that I'm based in Louisiana. And I'm going to talk about these systems here on the screen. Some of you might be familiar with them. The top photo in the coastal part is the Western Scheldt estuary, which is in the Netherlands, that I used for my PhD work. And now we're working more in the delta, in the Mississippi River Delta. So the two pictures at the bottom are Wax Lake Delta on the left and the Bird's Foot Delta, which are two of the active delta parts in the Mississippi River Delta. And so I'm not going to talk about the fluvial part, but on the coastal. And so the main idea is that landforms are very versatile, and especially estuaries are very diverse. But of course, they also have common features, such as that they have like a funnel-shaped morphology. So if we look at the example here of the Dovey estuaries in Wales, we have a wider mouth area, a wider estuary that then kind of confines towards the river. And all estuaries have some characteristic channel bar patterns that are different between systems, and understanding those drivers on how estuaries rearrange and how the morphology changes through space and time, that's the main focus of my PhD work. And obviously, we will have abiotic drivers that shape the morphology. So we have the river discharge, the tides, the waves that can shape sediment transport, depending on which estuary we're looking at. And the sediment transport depends on the grain size. So many estuaries are sandy or muddy, but there are also estuaries that hold gravel. And so all of these interactions will shape the dynamics within the estuary. We also have boundary constraints. So geology, for example, bedrock outcrops that limit how far our estuaries can widen, or as humans modifying the edges of estuaries because we like them and we like living in them. And so therefore also limiting the natural widening that estuaries might experience. And this is all very exciting, but what I find personally even more exciting is these organisms that occupy sediments. If you look at some of these tidal flats here, you will see that there is some green areas that already indicate that these sand flats are inhabited. And so there are a range of different species that occupy these sediments, and understanding how they influence the large geomorphology and what their role is was one of the main aims of my PhD, and is still ongoing research at LSU. So we talk about these species in terms of ecosystem engineering. So ecosystem engineering species modify the environment and their habitat. So they can either directly or indirectly change resources that then affect the habitat of themselves and of others. And here's just a few examples of aquatic ecosystem engineering species. Generally, we say that all species on Earth have some kind of ecosystem engineering activity, but those here on the screen are the ones that have been extensively studied and that I have investigated in my work. And so one of the most important ones that I think most of us are familiar with is vegetation. Vegetation has a large role, but there are also some of the smaller organisms, such as crabs and worms, that will modify the morphology and the environment. And so since we are interested in the geomorphology, we can roughly classify them into biostabilizers and biodestabilizers, where they can either help protect the sediments against erosion or they promote it. Today, because we have not so much time, I will focus on the vegetation work that we've been doing. And I will hint at some of the other work that we did on the bioturbators, but the main focus of this talk will be on vegetation, and specifically salt marsh vegetation. And vegetation induces a roughness on the flow because it blocks the flow, that then decelerates and enhances deposition, and over time that accretion of the sediments. And generally speaking, we know that this flow resistance depends on how much vegetation we have. So how tall is my vegetation compared to the water level? Am I blocking the entire cross-section or just a part of the cross-section? Is my vegetation very dense or more sparse? Those two factors are considered the main drivers in what the vegetation impact is on the flow. There's also a lot of ongoing work looking at more intricate feedbacks on arrangement of vegetation stems and more the smaller scale impacts of vegetation. But for our work, because we're thinking about the larger scale, we think of vegetation in terms of a roughness. And so the relationship between the biomass of the vegetation and the roughness is still the main determinant of the vegetation effects on the flow. So, but if we then go to the field, and this is a picture from the Netherlands, from one of the tidal bars in the Western Scheldt in March, nice weather here in the field work. We find that there is not as much biomass as we might expect. So we can actually see some necromass, some dead vegetation patches that kind of have some root systems. We have a little bit of Salicornia, like a really sparse vegetation species colonizing the front, but generally there's not a lot of vegetation. If we go to the same place in June, we find that the vegetation has already grown and increases its effect on the flow likely. And then in the fall, this species aster flowers, which creates these really tall stems that actually are tall enough to hide my colleagues here on the mudflat. So there is not just we have a lot of vegetation or no vegetation or a little bit of vegetation, but we have to also consider this change in vegetation through space and time in estuaries to understand the impacts on the morphology. And so thinking about how we can model this, we cannot just simplify vegetation as being there or not, but we have to consider the life history traits. And life history traits is basically an overarching term that is referring to the seasonal growth that I just showed you, but it could also refer to establishment strategies and expansion strategies. So do we have seed dispersal or rhizomal growth of vegetation, etc. So this is a term used for the different ecological strategies of the species. And those different species have different traits because of the life history components that we want to consider. They interact with each other and the landscape. So it's not just one species, but maybe there are several with different traits. And they respond also to changes in their habitat. So if we, for example, have a change in the boundary conditions with increasing sea levels or more rainfall, or the salinity or temperature changes, this will also change the vegetation. It will not just survive any condition as before. And all of these interactions then result in a biogeomorphic feedback loop. So we have on the one hand the ecosystem engineering species, and on the other hand the geomorphology. And this is just an example of an estuary, but this holds for any landform really. And so the species will alter its habitat through this ecosystem engineering effect that's very species specific and that varies in space and time and alters the geomorphology. But the geomorphology will provide habitat because the bed level controls flooding and salinity intrusion, etc. So when the habitat then changes, that also affects, again, the species and so on. So we do not have just a linear feedback between all of those mechanisms, but a nonlinear interaction that then over time will give us emerging patterns, both of the species and the morphology that changes dynamically in space and time. And so my aim was and still is to get this biogeomorphic feedback loop into our models and to my numerical models. And so we developed a dynamic ecomorphodynamic model that tries to capture the processes that drive vegetation changes through time in MATLAB through parameterizing establishment, growth, and mortality. And you see in the little sketch at the top that we initialize vegetation establishment based on rules on seed dispersal, and then over time the vegetation will grow. And when the habitat is not 100% suitable, then the vegetation can also be removed. So the total fraction of each grid cell will be reduced if the mortality is not 100% perfect. And if the habitat is 100% perfect, is dependent on the physical parameters. And so we couple this MATLAB model with Delft3D, in this case with Delft3D Flow, which solves the shallow water equations and sediment transfer on morphology. So a very sophisticated physics-based model that captures the physical processes, and then we couple those two to get the biogeomorphic feedback loop. So on the one hand, we provide habitat to the species based on parameters that we know impact their survival, such as inundation or flow velocities that can cause uprooting. And we use those habitat thresholds from the literature. So we look at studies in the field or in the flume that report how long a certain type of species can be inundated or which velocities it can resist. And that's how we parameterize where vegetation can establish and is eventually maybe removed. And resulting from the distribution of vegetation from this habitat computations, we then calculate a hydraulic roughness. That is the ecosystem engineering effect that then feeds back into the physics-based equations and then basically creates this feedback loop between the vegetation changing and the physics changing and so on. And so in this case, we have captured the biogeomorphic feedback loop. This model was novel because it was one of the first ones that can couple at very dense time steps, meaning that we can resolve seasonal growth. It's very flexible. So in our studies, we use 2-week updates. So we update the vegetation growth every 2 weeks. So we can capture the seasonal growth in the marshes in the Netherlands. We have age classes that allow us to adjust the resistance to stresses with age of the vegetation. So if you think about a small seedling, it might die quicker of inundation than a mature plant. So we can capture those effects. And we can also model several species at the same time that have different parameterizations in terms of habitat and growth, etc. So basically, we're parameterizing the entire MATLAB box there per species separately, and we have them all in one model. And this model I use to address my research objectives, which are to reproduce and understand where species establish and in what pattern they form in conjunction with the morphodynamic changes in estuaries and deltas. I'm interested in different types of species and their different traits and how that influences geomorphic change and species pattern. I'm interested in the large scale morphology as well, so not just the local scale of the vegetation, and then having multiple vegetation species in one estuary. How does that change the estuary compared with just one representative species, for example? And so the first application was in the Western Scheldt. The Western Scheldt is located here in at the border between Belgium and the Netherlands. And it's a very important estuary generally, but also economically, because it connects the port of Antwerp with the North Sea, which is one of the most important ports in Europe. And so there's a lot of monitoring data available. This is also a heavily engineered estuary with dredging, and you can see there is levees around this estuary. But there's a lot of data available, which allowed us to test the model and see how well it works. And we were lucky that there was a calibrated hydromorphodynamic model in Delft 3D available at the time that we can couple our vegetation model with. And so I was testing how well the vegetation model predicts vegetation establishment on this tidal bar here, because that tidal bar saw recent vegetation establishment and expansion. And so here we have 3 panels through time. On the left, the data showing how vegetation colonized the bar and then expanded through time. So we have vegetation establishment at the highest elevations here. Here's like some kind of little ridge where the vegetation can grow. And then through time, we get dense vegetation, which is the dark green, surrounded by sparser vegetation, and then even more vegetation cover even now. And so the model produce these results where the colors also denote the density of the vegetation, basically. So the darker green is more vegetation. Most of the grid cell is covered with vegetation, while the sparser is less vegetation. And we were actually quite happy with it because we get this typical density gradient where the highest elevations are covered by denser vegetation, and we have a sparser vegetation colonizing around it. We do have an overprediction of vegetation here on the western side of the bar, and especially in the first year. In this year, the bathymetry had also a lower resolution, so that's partly due to that fact as well. But on average, if we compare the cell-to-cell comparison, we get 60% of the cells correctly. And I just want to highlight that I was actually really happy about this result because we do not calibrate the vegetation. We just take the literature threshold and the vegetation established in these locations. So it's not that I selected the habitat parameters based on whatever conditions we have on the tidal bar, but this is kind of an emerging pattern that just came from the parameterization based on the literature. And so we apply this model to then test what the impact is on the morphology. And I'm now moving to the impacts of mud, because mud is not very abundant in the Western Scheldt, but it is very important, especially for salt marsh vegetation. If you look at this photo here, we see that the aster vegetation actually covers a thick layer of mud here. And mud is important because it is cohesive and therefore important for stabilizing geomorphology. It helps grow land, and it's also ecologically valuable. So some species, they really prefer muddy sediments and they don't like sandy sediments. And so if we go to the maps and we look at where vegetation is and where mud is, we find them coinciding in most of the cases. So all cells that have vegetation also have some type of mud cover. And so that leads to 2 contrasting hypotheses. One is that we have vegetation that establishes and then accretes the mud. Or the alternative is that first the mud deposited on the tidal bar that then raised the elevations and then facilitated vegetation establishment in turn. So it's kind of a chicken and egg question that we can actually address now with this dynamic vegetation model. So I address two research questions. Where do we find first the mud and where first the vegetation when we look at this tidal bar that I just showed you? And then there is something that I already hinted at, that some vegetation species, they really prefer mud. So they're kind of sensitive to how much mud you have in the soil for their establishment. And so I wanted to model that and see if that has an impact on where vegetation establishes and how much mud will be collected and how the pattern changes through time. So I run 3 scenarios. The first one is no vegetation, just the physics to see if we get mud deposition without vegetation. The second one is a general saltmarsh species that is inspired by a conglomerate of the vegetation species that are living on this tidal bar, but that species can grow on either sand or mud. So it's not selective for the type of substrate that's on the tidal bar. And then a third species that is mud dependent, I call the mud dependent species because it is selective for substrate and it grows only in areas that have more than 30% mud. And so these are the results. The left maps are the same maps I showed you earlier. And then we have the generic species that establishes, as we saw before. And on the right-hand side, we have the mud-dependent species. And so the mud-dependent species seems to establish, which suggests that mud can settle on the bar without the vegetation, but it has a smaller cover than the generic vegetation species. But it follows the same pattern that it has a denser part in the center of the bar and then a sparser vegetation cover around the bar. We then look at the mud fraction in the top layer on the tidal bar. We find that there is a lot of mud in the vegetation, especially in the generic case here. We also find mud in the mud-dependent species case, but we also find mud when there's no vegetation. And that's specifically in this eastern tip of the bar because that's kind of a sheltered area. So these are the high elevations. And so when the tide comes in, it kind of goes over the high elevations and it kind of gets diverted. So it does not reach these areas very much. So in those sheltered areas, we do actually get mud deposition also without vegetation. And so we see an increase in mud with vegetation cover, which is not surprising because that aligns really well with theory. But what's interesting is that part here in the center of the bar. So we do see that we have a slight overestimation of mud here compared with the ecotope maps on the left for the generic case, but we do not get a lot of mud here without vegetation. With the mud-dependent species, however, we get an expansion of the mud in those higher areas from the feedbacks with the vegetation. So basically what that means is that the vegetation that's mud dependent can establish on the tidal bar and then expands its cover through time and therefore enhances deposition of mud and therefore can expand even more. And so that was kind of a cool finding because it showed how vegetation positively alters its own habitat and allows it to expand and accrete the mud over time, but also help itself survive on the tidal bar. So vegetation is important for mud accretion in this tidal bar and also in the Western Scheldt in general. We find that in dynamic intertidal areas, vegetation is needed to get mud deposition because we would not get enough mud otherwise. If we have quieter areas that are more sheltered, even without the vegetation established, we can also get mud deposition without vegetation that then could facilitate the establishment of mud-sensitive species. And then we saw that there's an ecosystem engineering effect of the mud-dependent species on itself that promotes a gradual increase in mud cover and then allows the vegetation to expand in conjunction with the mud cover. So that was an application of this dynamic vegetation model that we developed in MATLAB. Now I would like to switch over to our Delta work and the work that my group has been doing at LSU. And so I'm really excited to share that we have made this model now available to the community. So my postdoc, Nelson Tao, has spent a lot of effort and has done some great work in translating the original MATLAB model into Python and making it open source available on GitHub. And you can see the link at the bottom here. We call this model DICOVE or DICOVE, which stands for Dynamic Coastal Vegetation Model. Basically is based on this model from 2019 in Python, and is coupled now with the new Delph3D version, Flexible Mesh, and with Anuga. Anuga is a hydrodynamic software package that is coming from Australia and is also more and more used now here in the US. So if you are interested in doing similar studies to what I just showed you, you can download and install this model. Nelson has put great effort into documenting everything and also having little examples. So everything should be straightforward, but if you encounter any issues with installing anything, please reach out. And so we applied DICOVE in two cases to see how we can predict vegetation establishment in other systems. So the first application was to couple it with Delph3D and look at vegetation establishment of 3 different intertidal vegetation species and their feedbacks with channel development. And so the 3 species that we modeled are down here, which are typical vegetation species that colonize the Western Scheldt estuary. And that test is based on a publication from 2020 where we looked at channel networks using the MATLAB model. The second case is kind of a new idea in trying to see how we can predict vegetation pattern in river-dominated areas, specifically deltas. The model has originally been written for tidal-dominated cases, and now we're also applying it to river-dominated cases. And I just want to briefly show you how it works. So for the first case, we have a tidal flat model that's just a simple tidal flat, such as here, that we use to establish 3 types of vegetation. And the 3 species are highlighted down here. I already showed you the photos in the previous slide. And this is just an example of how complex vegetation can be parameterized and how we distinguish between species. So this is a typical seasonal cycle throughout the year where we can specify the colonization event of each species. And then we have a plant growth time, and we have also a winter time where the vegetation dies off. So we can have different seasonality of the vegetation in the model, and that's how we parameterize those 3 species. In addition, we also have habitat parameters based on inundation and velocity, but this would be also differences in the life history traits I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. And so this Baidefate paper here in 2020 modeled these 3 species on this tidal flat and then looked at how tidal channel networks differ between any of those 3 species and their combination. So looking at each species individually and then also all 3 species in conjunction. And with the MATLAB model, that worked really well. And now we just want to see if DICOVE can reproduce the same patterns. And so we take a similar domain where we again have a slope from the deeper water to the land boundary, and we have a simple ocean boundary here with the tidal forcing, and then we basically allocate the vegetation based on inundation, velocity, and bed level changes and their seasonal parameters. And so I brought 2 results here. On the left, we have all 3 species together. And so this is the tidal flat, and the colors are the vegetation types. And the first thing you notice is maybe that there are these kind of gaps here between the vegetation cover, and those are the channel networks that develop because of the biogeomorphic feedbacks between the vegetation and the sand flat. And then around those channels, we see the vegetation cover. And if we look at the cross section, so going from the sea boundary to the land boundary here, this is what I show at the bottom. So this is the distance from the left boundary and then the vegetation fraction for the 3 species. And we see that the green species grows mainly towards the seaside, the red species grows towards the land side, and then Spartina, which is an invasive species in the Netherlands, grows everywhere. And that is actually accurate compared with the literature. So Salicornia, the green one, is a very flood-tolerant species and colonizes more like in a patchy fashion closer to the ocean side. Fuchsinelia is a later successional stage that's more at the higher side. So we actually are able to reproduce the same species distribution patterns that we would expect compared with the literature. The case on the right is taking out Spartina, which I mentioned is invasive. And so basically we see the same pattern, just that Spartina took over and took away some of the habitat of the red and the green species that can now thrive if Spartina does not outcompete it. So we're really happy with those results. So then the next case was to look at the river-dominated delta. And we take Wax Lake Delta as an example for this. For those who are not familiar with Wax Lake Delta, this is a map of Louisiana, and Wax Lake Delta is here where the little star is. And we use this delta because, again, it's one of the most well-studied deltas in the Gulf region, because it's a very young delta that has been growing over the last 50 years. And so there's a lot of data available where we can just study how deltas form and grow through time. And so we use this delta because we have a topography and a bathymetry of that delta that we then can model to model our vegetation establishment. And so in Wax Lake Delta, we can distinguish vegetation species very well based on the elevation gradient. So if you look at these colors here, they actually show you the elevation distribution just divided into subtidal, intertidal, and supratidal elevations. So we have the dark blue, which is the subtidal, and then the further we get into the island, the higher the elevation becomes. And those elevations can be related to different species, which are here on the right-hand side. So we do have this zonation of different species, similar as in temperate estuaries in the results I just showed you before. And we can relate those to different elevations. And we model two species that represent Nelumbo lutea, which is a lower intertidal species. The light blue bar is the elevation range where it occurs. And then a higher vegetation species, Colocasia, which grows in the upper intertidal / supratidal elevations. And so now we want to see if we can reproduce this species distribution based on elevation with our process-based dynamic vegetation model. And I'm just showing you a little GIF of the simulations, how it looks. So we run the delta with a hydrograph. I'm just going to switch back here for 5 years. So we have the river discharge here in blue, and the orange is the tide. So we have both the river and the tide, so unsteady river discharge. And then we model the vegetation establishment. And so the green area is the vegetation, and the darkness of the green is this average stem height of the vegetation. And so over time, you can see that vegetation establishes at the margins of the islands. And we see also the seasonal cycle where the vegetation becomes the winter height in the winter and then grows again over the summer. And so if we do a comparison now with our elevation distribution, we can test how well the vegetation cover from those models now relate to the elevation distributions from the literature. And this is the result of the vegetation distribution. So we do have in dark green the higher intertidal species and in light green the lower intertidal species, showing that we get a nice zonation where the lower intertidal is actually occupying the lower elevations compared with the elevation map. Again, if we do a cell-to-cell comparison, we can count the cells that were correctly predicted. And so this is a map of the cells that were correctly predicted. So green is the correct vegetation, and then orange is where we should have predicted vegetation, but we actually predicted bare soil. And red is the areas where we should have predicted bare soil, but we actually predicted vegetation. And so there is some mismatches. We generally underestimating vegetation cover. But overall, if we look at the total precision and recall in terms of an F1 score, we get above 0.8, which is good performance. just from these process-based processes. And then if we compare with the vegetation species, so how well did we actually allocate each of the two species, we get a really high score for Colocasia, the upper intertidal species, but a medium score for Nelumbo, which is the lower intertidal species. And that is related with the hydrograph, because the hydrograph and the unsteady discharge changes the inundation throughout the year. And so it's more difficult to predict a lower intertidal species based on inundation than a higher intertidal species, because the intertidal zone shifts with the hydrograph. But overall, we were quite happy with this result because it is quite challenging to predict vegetation based on these establishment processes. So this was a part on Dikovy. I'm not now going to talk more about deltas, but looking at morphodynamic models, looking at exploratory delta models. And so some of you might be familiar with this, but exploratory delta modeling is very common, and there are a lot of studies. I just put a few here, looking at the first order principles of delta morphology in interaction with the hydrodynamics. And it's no surprise, hopefully, to any of you that we are interested in looking how dynamic vegetation over time and space changes these complex morphodynamic systems. And so we know from a bunch of other studies, I just put a few here at the bottom, but there are many more looking at the impacts of vegetation and mud on delta morphology. We know that from this bulk of work that vegetation promotes generally sediment deposition. We know that vegetation can block flow into the islands of deltas if it's too dense, which can actually reduce the deposition on delta islands and the connectivity. Because of that blocking effect, flow can be channelized into the main channels, which then will lead to deeper and narrower channel systems in vegetated deltas. And generally, we would expect a lower dynamic of the channels and fewer channels because the vegetation kind of stabilizes the whole delta. And also vegetation can help grow the elevations of deltas because it can produce soil. So when vegetation produces leaves and roots, it will create biomass that then will help elevate the delta islands through time. So this is what vegetation does. Mud in deltas is pretty similar because mud is cohesive and it protects the banks against erosion, it stabilizes the islands, which leads to narrower and deeper channels. And mud can also settle in vegetation and in top of levees, and therefore increase the elevation at the delta islands, which then can have an impact on the connectivity between the channel and the islands again. And so my student, Anderson, he is very interested in studying this, this combination. How does mud change the morphology? How does vegetation change the morphology, and the two in conjunction? And is there kind of a transition between when vegetation is more important or when mud is more important? And so he uses exploratory delta modeling. He models 60 years of delta evolution of the with two dynamic species. And again, it's the same species that I showed you just before that we used in Dikovy, the lower and higher intertidal species based on Wax Lake Delta. And he looks at two different maximum densities. So what's the maximum stem density that a grid cell can carry? And he looks at a very sparse vegetation cover of just 20 stems per square meter, and then a dense vegetation of 200 stems per square meter to check if that has any impact on the morphodynamic evolution. And I'm showing one simulation where we grow a delta through time. You can see that the islands emerge and then immediately get colonized with vegetation. And so we have the two vegetation species here, where the yellow is the lower species and the dark green is the higher intertidal species. And you can see that the vegetation can colonize large parts of the island that then stabilizes the morphology through time. And hopefully, maybe I can go back. If I play one more time, you can see that once the islands come out, they actually become colonized immediately. So there's this feedback loop between habitat being created and the vegetation immediately colonizing and modifying its habitat. So there's like a feedback where we update the biogeomorphic interactions every coupling. And so these are just general maps of some of his results. He's interested in looking at how increasing mud affects the morphology. So that is what we see here on the y-axis. So at the top, we have deltas that are only sandy. And then with distance to the bottom, we have an increase in mud. And so at the bottom, we have 60% of the sediment being mud. And then this is the no vegetation case, and then he compares it with the sparse vegetation case. There's also dense vegetation case, but I only show the sparse here. And we can see that there is a transition from a typical sandy delta with a lot of small scale channels to a muddy delta that has fewer small scale channels, but more of the deeper channels because the flow gets funneled into the channels and kind of can erode and create deeper and narrower channels. With vegetation, we see the same transition. So we have a lot of small scale channels in the sandy delta, even with the vegetation. And then with increasing mud content, we get a similar pattern where the flow gets channelized into the channels. But we also see that if you focus on this mouth bar here in the center, that with increasing mud, we seem to get higher levees at the edges of the islands. So there is some feedback locally on the island morphology of the vegetation, but just from looking at the maps, we cannot see a big difference between the non-vegetated and vegetated delta. However, if we actually quantify the number of channels, we do see a difference. And so what Anderson did, he looked at the channelized area of the delta during low flow, which is these pink channels, and then during high flow, which is during the peak flow in the spring in Wax Lake Delta or in deltas. And we see that there is a lot more channelization when we have high flow because we have all the small scale channels that get activated, up to almost half of the delta area in this case. And then he compared those two with the mud, with increasing mud content and with the vegetation. Oops. And so here, that's the result. So on the bottom, we have increasing mud content from a sandy delta to a muddy delta. And then the y-axis is the channelized fraction. And for the low flow scenario, which are the solid lines, we see that the vegetated delta actually has a much lower channelized fraction than the non-vegetated delta. And the same is true during the high flow scenario. So although it's not directly obvious from the maps if we have more or less channels with vegetation, the analysis show that vegetation reduces the channelization of the delta because it helps infilling of the secondary channels and kind of prevents cutting of new channels on the islands. And the other thing that was interesting is that with increasing mud content, the channelization reduces because mud can infill the smaller channels, and that effect is stronger under the influence of vegetation. So while we see a decrease in these two lines here for increasing mud content, that effect is stronger with vegetation, suggesting that the combined effect of vegetation and mud leads to infilling of those small-scale channels. And then the last thing I want to show you is actually the feedback with the vegetation cover, which is preliminary but quite interesting. So here we have again increasing mud supply from left to right, but now we look at the total vegetated area. And we see that with increasing mud content, the vegetated area also increases. So more area of the delta becomes suitable for vegetation colonization, which makes sense because the mud helps accrete the islands and then help the vegetation expand itself. So a similar process as I mentioned before with the mud content. The other thing that's interesting is that it's mainly the higher intertidal species that can expand. So we see kind of a shift from a mainly lower intertidal species colonizing the sandy delta to a higher intertidal species colonizing the muddy delta. So it's not just an expansion of the mud species, but also a successional stage shift where the later or higher intertidal vegetation can colonize a larger area, kind of shifts the community distribution between intertidal, between the lower and higher intertidal vegetation. So kind of a fun feedback with the ecological processes as well. Okay, so this was our work on deltas. I just want to highlight one thing. I didn't have time to talk about the biodestabilizers or the biofilms, but the model in MATLAB has all of those incorporated. So we are not only looking at the vegetation and Delft 3D model, but we also have a bioturbator Delft 3D model and a biofilm model, and they're all coupled together as well. So it's possible to model vegetation together with biofilm and vegetation together with bioturbators, etc. This model is not in Python yet. So if that's something that you're interested in, please reach out. The oysters are there in dashed lines because that's work in progress. They're not implemented yet, but that's one of the other main biostabilizers that will need to be implemented in the model. And so for future work in my group, we are still working on quantifying the ecosystem engineering effect on vegetation and morphology, in this case with deltas. There are several other studies looking at these feedbacks, specifically thinking about the role of an individual species versus community ecosystem engineering. So if we have several species in a system, and then with the idea in mind that this will help improve restoration and nature-based engineering solutions, especially in the Gulf region. There's this recent study that came out in 2024 that looked at the success rate of vegetation restoration projects globally. And they found that only 50% of the plantings are actually surviving and successful. And I hypothesized that one of the reasons is that we do not fully understand these feedbacks between the biology and the geomorphology, especially when it comes to several species. So that's ongoing work that I'm sure will be very exciting in the next few years. So to wrap up, we saw that salt marsh traits affect vegetation pattern, especially when we think about the deposition of mud and the larger scale morphology. We see that vegetation has a feedback where it expands itself and therefore alters the larger scale morphology as well. Our dynamic vegetation model, DICOVI, produces the vegetation patterns and zonations that we expect of several species, both in tide and river-dominated environments. And from the work of my student, Anderson, we saw that dynamic vegetation drives delta morphology and reduces the channelization in conjunction also with the supply of mud. I want to thank my co-authors on the publications that I showed, and very special thanks to my postdoc Nelson and Anderson for supplying the figures and doing great work in deltas. And hopefully we can update you soon on the papers. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Dr. Buchner, Muriel, for an insightful presentation. We'll start the Q&A session, and if anyone has questions, please post your questions in the chat.
Well, I'll ask one to get us started. When you're doing you showed, I think it was like 3 years of vegetation growth. When they die, do they just vanish from the model? Like, and is that realistic for the species you're modeling? I would expect like some branches or, twigs to still be present.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you so much. So there are several ways in how the vegetation can die. So it can die at the end of the year because it's winter. And then the user can specify if you want to have a winter height that accounts for necromass, or just because the vegetation is still a little bit there. It can also remove the entire vegetation species if we know that the entire species is removed. And then through time, the vegetation only dies because of the habitat. So if the flooding increases through time, then the vegetation will disappear. But it has also the chance to recolonize every year. So even if it died off because there was a flood at the end of, in September, let's say, when it recolonizes in March, it's able to replace itself and produce new seeds and new vegetation plants.
Thanks.
We have a question from Malika in the chat. Muriel, did you model mud using Delft 3D sediment transport model by specifying the mud properties, or integrated another model to model mud?
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, I didn't have time to go into the detail of the Delft 3D parameterization, but we used the Delft 3D mud sediment transport mechanism. So we have both mud and sand that are computed with Delft 3D through different equations. And for mud, we parameterize the critical shear stress, the settling velocity, to estimate when mud is being transported and eroded. So that's a great question. Thank you.
I have one. Can you detail a bit more about the time step of the model and how can it capture the dynamics and rates of the tides and floods and vegetation growth in your model?
Yes, that is a great question. And so, so I said we update the vegetation every 2 weeks, which means we update it in morphodynamic time. So what that means is we simplify the hydrodynamics. So if we have one tidal cycle, in morphodynamic modeling, you would upscale that tidal cycle to a morphodynamic time by saying one tidal cycle is representative of 10 tidal cycles. And therefore, if I model one, I have a morphology that changes as if we had 10 tidal cycles. And so we use a similar scaling for the vegetation as well, where we say one tidal cycle is 2 weeks of hydrodynamic, represents 2 weeks of hydrodynamics for the vegetation. And so when I say we couple the model every 2 weeks, it means we're thinking about this ecological time scale, not the hydrodynamic time scale. But that is something that is definitely a simplification, and that's very difficult to overcome. The different time scales in which the hydrodynamics act and the morphology acts and the ecology acts. So it's definitely an ongoing challenge.
Thanks.
All right. Next question. Is there an impact of climate, temperature variation, extreme events on vegetation growth in addition to the parameters of the deltas you mentioned? And if so, can you include it in the model?
Yes, so that's a great question. So for example, in Wex Lake Delta, we know that hurricanes and storms and waves do have quite an impact on the vegetation pattern and can basically remove the vegetation and then it recolonizes. We have not modeled these disturbances yet in the model. The problem again is the time scale, the coupling that I just mentioned. But what could be done is if we know a storm comes and removes the vegetation, you could remove the vegetation in a time step and then basically have an intermittent disturbance regime. But you will not be able to actually compute that process. You would basically just rip out the vegetation yourself and then say, this was a hurricane, and then restart the model and then keep running your simulation. So you would not be capturing the process of the vegetation being disrupted, but you could approximate that in the model to see what it does with the morphology. In terms of temperature, that is not included in the model. We do not have sensitivity to temperature. Again, what could be done is you could approximate that when vegetation becomes older, that it might die faster in a scenario with high vegetation or with low vegetation. So you could run different scenarios where you adjust the sensitivity of the vegetation in a way what you would expect to happen under temperature, but it's not an option to change the temperature in a simulation itself. So when you run the simulation, you cannot adjust the temperature over the simulation. DAO3D does model temperature in the water, but the feedback with the vegetation doesn't exist. That's great questions. Was there a third one now? Was there another part of the question?
No, how to include them, but I think you addressed it.
Yeah, no, temperature is not included.
We have another comment or question from Ajay Kumar, which thank you for your interesting talk. He's interested in the impact of invasive species in these kind of dynamics. I sent some publication fees, but we'll share it with you after the talk. So here's question: how, if we can model or we can involve this kind of mangrove or invasive species into these models?
Yes, that's a great question. So yes, you can incorporate them if you know how they outcompete the other species. So for example, I showed this this comparison between the 3 species run and the 2 species run in the mudflat model, and that was actually approximating invasive species. So in this case, we model an invasive scenario on the left and a non-invasive scenario on the right. So because Spartina is invasive in those marshes, and you can see that the Spartina basically takes over the habitat and pushes out the other species. And that's because there's competition for space in this model. So each grid cell can only hold a certain amount of vegetation. And if that amount that can be carried in each grid cell is filled up by the invasive species, then the native species cannot occupy it anymore. And so over time, it will be gradually outcompeted. So if you know that that's the reason why your invasive species is more competitive, you could include this competition for space. You could also adjust the sensitivity to different habitat parameters. So if one species is less sensitive to flooding, for example, then obviously it will take over the cells gradually over a native species that might be more sensitive to flooding. So you can incorporate as long as you know what the reason is and if it's related to any of those parameters. If it's competition for light, for example, we do not have that in the model. I know that especially with regard to mangroves, that's an important point, and there is a paper that came out last year modeling that, showing that is important for mangrove marsh systems. So that model does not have this competition for light, but we do have indirect competition through space. So it really depends on the case, but we've been thinking about this a lot because in Wax Lake Delta, there's also collocator is actually an invasive species. So it's interesting to think about this from a vegetation dynamics as well. But that's something that the model could do to some extent. But we are also thinking about having more direct competition, but we haven't really gotten there yet. So I'm happy to discuss this also more in detail. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again, Muriel, for sharing your interesting research with us. We look forward to future research from your group. And thank you all of the audience who joined us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then, yeah, sorry to jump in. I was just getting ready to say, we don't have a speaker in July. We take a break. We'll be back in August. So hope everyone enjoys Northern Hemisphere the summer, Southern Hemisphere, whatever winter brings down your way. We'll see you in August again. Thanks, Muriel. Great talk.
Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for joining.
Thanks, Muriel. That's great.